This is the Church History Lecture number 24. And here we're starting to get into the history of the modern church, some of which we covered in the videotape. Everybody here for the videotape, or who didn't see the videotape?
Jim Franks is on that.
Jim Franks was a minister actually in United now, but at the time that the church was doing some pretty heavy church history research, he was a research assistant in that process. So he had a lot of great material on the church, basically, primarily the church coming into North America. It was really interesting. They tracked down, not Roger Williams. Stephen Mumford's house in Providence, Rhode Island, and things like that. It's pretty obvious in terms of looking back on the history of the church how God opened doors for His people to continue to be able to worship. England was not as open to the idea of different religious persuasions as we like to think of the Western world today. It was actually quite intolerant of anybody who did not toe the line, so to speak. There are a lot of different reference books. I mentioned it at the end of the... Did she nip?
No.
Okay. I'm going to be handing out a bibliography at the end of this, which we're approaching, believe it or not. And I'll be able to give everybody a series of books that, for instance, some of you may be aware of this, but Ivor Fletcher's A True History of the Church, or History of the True Church, which covers only a part of the history, primarily the later history, and then things like Duggar and Dodd, which most people are familiar with. Duggar and Dodd, that's Church of God Seventh Day, and what they recount as far as the history of the church in the modern era, what we know of, what would be the Sardis era church. Now, the Sardis era church, in many ways, did a better work overseas than it did in the United States. They were very effective at sending out missionaries, but they weren't very effective in the United States. Never were. So just to review, you remember Roger Williams, who was truly an odd bird. I don't believe he was at all tied to the Church of God, although some people have said he was baptized by Stephen Mumford later on in his life. But he sounds like a lot of people we have today who are very self-willed, have their own ideas, and cause problems in every group they come into. And that sounded like what Roger Williams was like. This issue of him getting kicked out of virtually every church he ever attended was part of what oriented him toward, a strong emphasis on religious freedom. He eventually got to the point where he never wanted to be considered a part of any church because of the different problems he had. So he was a big push behind the founding of Rhode Island. And it's interesting, even in secular history, you can read about how Rhode Island was founded primarily as a state that emphasized religious freedom. Some of the other states talked about it, but it was limited. And in function, they didn't do a very good job of actually living up to the values they espoused. Rhode Island was one place where you could go and truly be exercise religious freedom. You got to consider in the Church of God, one of the characteristics of the Church of God has regularly been pacifism. We do not participate in wars. The Quakers also did not participate in the Revolutionary War, for instance. But for some reason, they felt like they had the right to dabble in politics anyway. Here, on the one hand, they weren't willing to fight for their country, but they wanted to get involved in... Nicholas? They at the same time wanted to dabble in politics. They wanted to be involved in the political discussions of the day. So therefore, during the early years of George Washington's first and second presidency, when they were debating issues of slavery, many of us don't realize that one of the outcomes of the Constitutional Convention that came up with the Constitution was that they knew how controversial the slavery issue was, so they put a provision in the Constitution that prohibited Congress from dealing with the slavery issue until 1808, which was 20 years beyond the Constitutional Convention. They kind of pushed it off in the future. Well, the Quakers started a petition drive and started agitating for getting slavery to be addressed 15 years before that. And so they were getting involved in politics up to their earlobes and creating a lot of resentment as a result, even though they wouldn't participate. So you can't kind of dabble in both worlds. The Church of God didn't do that. The Church of God stayed out of politics. Now, when you go back into looking at the Sardis era church, it's a lot like what I talked about today, about the fact that we have more of the truth than many eras of the Church of God ever had. It's an interesting question to ask yourself, what is the minimum amount of truth that a group could have and be considered a part of the Church of God? Any thoughts on that?
Sabbath would be holy day.
Say again.
What would be the minimum amount of truth that a group would have to be the church and still be the Church of God?
Doctrines in Hebrew.
Mainly the Sabbath.
Well, the Sabbath is one, because God...
Christ.
Nature of God...
There were times in...
Oh, right, the fact that Jesus Christ was divine, yes.
There were times, though, when they did not observe the holy days.
Right, precisely. Sabbath, though, is given as a sign between... It's said multiple times in the Old Testament, it's a sign between me and my people. Sabbath is an absolute requirement. What's one other?
The Ten Commandments.
Okay, an adherence to the Ten Commandments in general, yes. The Passover is one of the most common. I'm not sure it was absolutely required. The name of the Church of God. If it did not have the name of the Church of God, if it had a formal name at all, it was not the Church of God. In other words, you couldn't be the Church of the Latter-day Advent, which is actually some of the arguments we're going to go through today, and be the Church of God. You're basically saying, I am not the Church of God, I am the Church of the Latter-day Advent, or whatever it might be. Or I am a Wesleyan, or I am a Methodist, which is names after what they do, not who they are functionally. So really, when you start talking about absolute, Sabbath and the name of the Church of God and the Ten Commandments are pretty much the three. Understanding, you could throw a fourth one in there, understanding that Jesus Christ was divine. Because again, I can't tell you how widespread and popular in the former worldwiders, I don't consider them, if you adhere to this, you're not a Christian, who maintain that Jesus Christ was a created being and then he was not divine. Now some of them will quibble and they'll say he's a created being, but he became divine. Well, no. Again, half-pregnant kind of a deal there.
Stavridis basically said he was divine and not human.
Stavridis was 3 bricks short of a load, but
you still have to...
But that's a different concept to say that he was divine and he was never fully human. That denies that he died for our sins.
Exactly. So you have to understand who and what Jesus Christ really was.
Okay. One of the other things, if they understood the Passover, generally they also understood that the resurrection was on a Saturday afternoon, not on a Sunday. So belief in a Saturday resurrection was characteristic of the early Sabbatarians of the Sardis era.
A lot of it is what they didn't observe. They didn't observe heaven and hell. Most of them didn't observe birthdays. They didn't observe it, believe in a Trinity. Those things are right. Infant baptism, adult baptism would be another.
You remember what we saw on the tape that the statement of beliefs of that one group of Stephen Mumford's. It was notable both in what it included and what it didn't include, though, in terms of it didn't. I don't think it said anything about the holy days. Did it mention the Passover? I can't remember.
It did.
So, by the way, if any of your friends are into the idea of the 15th Passover, we talked about this before, but it's worth mentioning again. What were Polycarp and his party called at the tail end of the Ephesian era, the beginning of the Smyrna era? There was a controversy over the Passover, Quartodemician controversy. The word Quartodemician inherently means the 14th. You look down through history, it mentions we observed the Passover in, for instance, one era of the church, I forget what it was I was reading about. We don't believe in keeping Easter, we believe in keeping the Passover on the 14th. The 15th controversy is almost unmentioned in church history. And that says more than all the other things we could say in many ways. The Church of God, it was never an issue. If it was a Passover, it was on the 14th. Okay, Duggar and Dodd were two of the leading elders that Mr. Armstrong dealt with, wrote, of the Sardis era, wrote a history of the true church, which I've got a copy of. It's not an authoritative reference, but it's a pretty good reference to give you an idea of how the history of the church developed in this time. They mention an article of the beliefs of the Church of God, a statement of doctrines written in 1705. Now they believe that there was one God, one Christ, and the Holy Spirit was not a person. Okay, that's interesting. Both Old and New Testament are inspired and to be taught and adhered to. The Ten Commandments are totally valid. Believe the 6 principles of Hebrews 6 as doctrine. Believe that what they called the Lord's Supper was to be administered and received in all churches, but they didn't make it clear in the statement of belief whether that was annually or what. Later on, after the turn of the century and even before that, 1800s, the Church of God Seventh Day, some of the groups taught that the Passover was to be done quarterly. So, kind of an interesting mix. Where they came up with that, I don't know. They believed in baptism by immersion, which is how the Baptists got their name, by the way. You know that. I mentioned last time how the Baptists do not believe they came out of the Protestant Reformation. That was really a revelation to me. I didn't understand that. They trace their history outside of Catholicism and Protestantism all the way back to the 1st century. Where did they get that idea?
Apostolic Christianity.
From the Church of God. They were a break-off from the Church of God. The Baptists were. So it's just interesting to kind of read that. Yes, ma'am.
You just said a minute ago that with the Passover that they said quarterly?
Some did.
Well, when I heard you say quarto whatever, quarto means 4, so it's like quarters.
Yeah, but quarter Domitian.
10.
I know people
Yeah, 4.
coming to the 4 part.
No, although that's an interesting thought, but no, the quarter in Domitian would be 14 in Latin.
Right, but then quarterly was like...
Who knows? You know, I mean, they didn't explain themselves in the reference books that I saw. From Duggar and Dodd, it says that this is the process they went through. Now, one of the things they did not understand was the true government. They went through a variety of... What do we have in United? We have basically a Presbyterian form of government, ruling by the presbytery, the ministry. In the Church of God, we have what would be called a top-down or hierarchical form of government, in the living Church of God. In the Church of God Seventh Day, or the Church of God of this era, they tried everything. They tried, a ruling by the presbytery. They didn't. The one thing they didn't try is really government from the top down, which is interesting. But Duggar and Dodd mentioned that 140 names were presented, and a box was prepared from which to draw the names according to the headings of God for these respective offices. As we approached the set time, it seemed that we could feel the presence of God. The power of His presence throughout the world circle of prayer was keenly apparent, so they felt that they were inspired in this. So then they basically, this was trying to draw the governing body of the church by lot, in effect. They put the names into a container and started pulling out names. They came up with 70, and their form of government was the rulership of kind of a Sanhedrin, in effect, the 70 at the top. And that's where Mr. Armstrong was chosen, as he was an elder at this time. He was chosen to be one of the 70. And it's interesting, we look back with 20/20 hindsight on Mr. Armstrong's history, and to try to understand how God revealed these various things to him. You could read in the autobiography how he studied to understand the Sabbath. And then how gradually that came to be true with the holy days as well. He did not understand at first the meaning of the holy days. He just became convinced that the church was obligated to keep it. So, and it's a prime example of God giving understanding after you obey. Well, one of the most popular things you'll read out in the dissident community, people who hate us, of whom there are plenty, is they will quote Mr. Armstrong's 1939 article on government. Anybody ever seen that? Okay. You know, the funniest thing about that is that if Mr. Armstrong didn't change in the 60 years he was in the ministry, didn't grow in his understanding, that they have to go back that far to find anything to justify their point of view. You know, it was a waste of time to use HW because HWA changed on the subject of government tremendously. So it just goes to show that, you know, as we look back from our own prejudices, our own history, and our own understanding. The Church of God, many times when we look back on it, the Church of God didn't understand a lot of the things you and I take for granted in understanding. So, 1842, we're looking at the history of the Church of God, so we'll be jumping around here a little bit. The Church of God, this didn't remain, by the way, did come to an understanding of the need to keep clean and unclean meats. Now there's what we call a comparatively minor doctrine, that they were on God was revealing things to them, and that was one of the things. So you'll encounter that, by the way, as you look back through history. We're kind of skipping around a lot in the sense that as you look back through the past 2,000 years, at times you'll run into this group and they'll mention that they keep the Sabbath and they keep Passover, and by the way, they also didn't eat pork. And they'll mention that in passing, and it's kind of like, you know, as you deal with these various groups, that's one of the things that helps you zero in on where God was really working. Because that wasn't a common thing, by the way.
What happened in 1939?
1939 was just when they had that selection of the 70 to rule, or to be the council in effect, and Mr. Armstrong was selected to be a part of that. That was before Mr. Armstrong split with Church of God Seventh Day. It just goes to show that they were trying all kinds of different governmental techniques, approaches on various things like that. From a history of the true church we read, concerning the Passover or the Lord's Supper, in at least one assembly of the early Sabbatarians in West Virginia, the following is illustrative. March 21st, 1853, it was voted that the communion service be held once in 12 months on the 14th day of the first Jewish month. So here is clear evidence that they were keeping the Passover on the 14th. They understood the Passover. The Church of God Seventh Day as a whole never really accepted the holy days beyond Passover and Pentecost. And Pentecost not generally. The diet of some of the early Sabbatarians in West Virginia can be understood from the following extract concerning the South Fork of the Hughes River Church in 1842. In their efforts to follow the mandates of the Mosaic Law, the flesh of swine for food was placed under ban. Mutton and beef tallow took the place of lard in cooking. A few of the more well-to-do used olive oil. I mean, olive oil was not easy to get in those days, by the way. So it goes to show, now here they used beef tallow and mutton fat in place of pork. Now, it's because they didn't have access to cooking oils very easily. And you know, even though we know for health's sake that's not a good idea, the primary thing when God says don't eat the fat, He's talking about don't eat the fat. Cooking oil, in Israel, fortunately, olive oil was easy to get a hold of even by the poor people. But in West Virginia, it wasn't. So
they all died.
well, that could be. I mean, you know, these were the days when Polish miners who immigrated in the United States, in Wisconsin, for instance, would go to work with lard sandwiches. Just a slab of lard between two pieces of bread.
That's good eating.
Yeah. So some of them were healthier than we are, amazingly enough.
Cold up there. Yeah, but that's how it is.
That's true. It's great fuel.
Cold in Denmark.
But that's pretty clear violation of what God intended, as opposed to having to use some beef fat to cook in. I'm not sure that would fall in the same category, especially if you didn't have access to anything better. Okay, Marge Brill, oh yeah, that's right, she's back east. Her kids are members of the Advent Church. It's a break-off from the Seventh-day Adventists. They no longer keep the Sabbath. Well, this whole Advent movement began in the early 1800s, where it began to be a part of the Church of God, and it started to cause controversy that eventually led to a split. Adventist means those who believe in Christ's advent, His return, right? So Seventh-day Adventists are people who keep the Sabbath. The reason they pick the name is it identifies them as people who keep the Sabbath, and we believe in the second coming of Christ. This is how that whole process developed. People began to get the impression through interpreting the 2130 years of 2300 days of Daniel that Christ was set to return in the mid-1800s. A man by the name of William Miller, the term Millerites comes to mind. My mother's maiden name was Miller, and she came from the part of Missouri, where a lot of these people ended up, by the way. Interesting. So it makes me wonder. She came out of Mennonite stock, but Mennonites are a break-off of what was the Anabaptist movement and everything in Europe, amongst whom went the Church of God. William Miller was converted initially to the Church of God, and he began preaching that the world would come to an end and Christ would return in 1844. He misinterpreted the prophecies involving that. He was very definitive about it. And so he convinced a whole lot of people to sell everything they had. I'm not sure whether they gave it to him or not, but they sold everything they had, and they put on white robes and they went out to stand on a mountaintop. And, no matter how much they tried to do this, they couldn't make it happen. Amazingly enough, while some were very disillusioned when it didn't happen, not everybody was, because he set a couple other dates after that, saying, "Oh, I forgot to carry my two," or whatever, and
kept them going, huh?
kept them going for a while. You know who saved the Church of God's bacon in that day from a populist point of view? Anybody know? Ellen G. White. Ellen G. White came up with the idea, which you can't prove out of the Bible, interestingly enough, but it goes to show most people don't have their noses in the Bible because they didn't notice that you couldn't prove it out of the Bible. She came up with the idea that Christ didn't return in 1844. How many of you have ever heard of the investigative judgment? All right. Key doctrine of Seventh-day Adventist Church. The idea was Christ went from one office to another office in heaven. The second office was the office that he went to begin the investigative judgment, and that's what happened in 1844. It's kind of convenient because there's no way you can prove it, but it sounds good apparently to some people. Yeah. So, reading from...
Mr. Gilchrist, what's the investigative judgment?
I'll get to that. Okay. So in the 1840s, this is 1844 that Miller happened, and then it was the later part of the 1840s that people were upset about the fact that Miller's prophecies weren't coming true. Here comes along Ellen G. White. And there's a lot of controversy over the issue of, okay, how do we identify ourselves? Now, when you don't have to organize politically and from a business point of view, a legal point of view, you can just be called the Church or the Church of God or the Way or anything. There's no formal name attached to it. It's what you consider yourselves to be. Well, there was a group that started pushing for the church to be called, changed from the Church of God. They felt the Church of God was too generic of a name. It wasn't descriptive enough. Good enough for God, but not good enough for them. So therefore, they decided that they started pushing for the term Seventh-day Adventist. Seventh day to mean we keep the Sabbath, Adventist to mean we believe in the return of Jesus Christ. And it would have been okay if they had called themselves the Seventh-day Adventist Church of God, but they didn't. They didn't want the church. Now, by the way, how many of you have heard that Joe DeKoch, Jr. is now pushing to change the name of the church?
Well, he should.
He should. I think it's of God.
He should.
I think it's of God because it is not a church of God. And I don't know if you've noticed, for many years I've called it the Worldwide Church. I will not finish it out because they are not the Church of God anymore. And so this is a good thing, but it goes to...
What's he going to call it?
Oh, he's already got it picked out. He's just going to go through this business of we're getting input, like he did on it.
What's he going to change it to? The Eighth-day Church of God?
The Joey and Michael show. Joey and Mikey show, I mean.
Joey and Mikey.
So here we're quoting and reading from the history of the Church of God, saying ridicule was heaped by the White Party, Ellen G. White, upon those who supported the name the Church of God. The pages of the Church's Review became a battleground for the church name around 1860 when the organizational drive fostered by the Whites came to fruition. Here's a typical presentation of the reason for the use of the name Seventh-day Adventist. From Green Springs, Ohio, we received the name Seventh-day Adventist because it contains the two leading principles of our faith. First, the second coming of our Lord, and second, it sets forth the fourth commandment. On the other hand, the name Church of God is not appropriate because there are many churches by that name, and so many by the same name would cause confusion. Waterman Phelps, previously mentioned as a convert of H.S. Case in Wisconsin, strongly supported the name Church of God in the Review. He went on to say, I think it's not difficult to determine what name they will have when we consult Revelation 14 verse 1, having his Father's name in their foreheads. Chapter 3 verse 12, I will write upon them the name of my God. And this agrees with the apostle in all his epistles. They are addressed to the Church of God, and he mentions all the scriptures involving that. Now, if we have the right to depart from the simplicity of the gospel in one instance, have we not the right in the other? If so, what does their confusion consist in? If so, can we as a people do the same and not be a member of the same great family of harlots? He's saying, in other words, it doesn't matter whether it's convenient. Is it convenient to keep the Church of God name? No, not when you've got 318 groups out there. Do you hear the latest? What was it? Raymond McNair's is the 21st Century Church of God. Ron Laughlin's is the Whole World Church of God. I mean, they're running out of adjectives. So it's not that it's convenient, it's that if you're going to be a part of the body of Christ, you bloomin' well better call yourself by the Father's name. So it's interesting how that happened. The high-pressure campaign led by the Whites to organize Sabbath Adventists under the name Seventh-day Adventists. Now, again, Ellen G. White had visions that strongly resembled epileptic seizures. They may have had other sources beyond that. Demonic possession oftentimes took form and operated as if it was a epileptic seizure. A lot of her visions didn't even agree with each other, by the way. And it kind of shows, not to put another Church of God group down, but Gerald Flurry has made several predictions that have not come about. He's gotten away with it because as long as you keep feeding the addiction that people have for that type of thing, they aren't going to hold you too much to details, which is odd, but that's true. At any rate, the Whites were organizing Seventh-day Adventists under the name Seventh-day Adventists, and they selected that ostensibly with the purpose of holding church property in a corporation instead of being deeded to individuals. What they're saying is, the church may be built on the land that was deeded to one of the members, and he technically owned it because the church was not a legal entity at that time. Well, they began to get the pressure that, we needed to become a legal entity so we can own property in our own right. Michigan had recently passed a law allowing churches to organize, and an official organization was said to be an encouragement for increasing the membership. So you see the various things they're using to pitch this on? Some Adventists did not go along with the change of name from the Church of God to the Seventh-day Adventists. Ohio appeared to be a leading center in objection to the White Party. The Review and Herald of April 9, 1861, in the article Secession, reports the following. Brother Smith, we conclude from the present aspects of that the name Seventh-day Adventist is being made obligatory upon our brethren. Without further light, Ohio cannot submit to the name Seventh-day Adventist as either a test or an appropriate name for God's people. Being appointed a finance committee at the last conference and having now on hand the means for carrying on the cause in Ohio, we could not conscientiously expend those means in any other way than the advancement and the extension of the truth and the Church of God. If that means that we expended ourselves otherwise, or if that means that if we need to secede, then we'll secede. That's what they're saying. They could not operate under the name Seventh-day Adventists. And we're not going to go into it in depth, but you could read about the James and Ellen G. White. Strange couple, strange woman. No precedent in New Testament times for the prominent leadership of a woman at all. So in many ways, it's wrong. And you know, she claimed to be a prophet. They came into the the Church of God from the Methodist Church. She believed she was a prophetess, and she kind of appointed herself to the role. From Duggar and Dodd, it says, D.M. Canright, an early Seventh-day Adventist who was intimate with the Whites, left them in the 1880s because he saw that the elder and Mrs. White ran and ruled everything with an iron hand. Not a nomination to office or a resolution, not an item of business was ever acted upon in business meetings till all had first been submitted to Elder White for his approval. And Mrs. White's revelations always favored Elder White and herself. If anyone dared question their course, they soon received a scathing revelation or vision but from Mrs. White denouncing the wrath of God upon them. I mean, if you have a self-appointed prophet, it's kind of like, oh, I don't like you. I think I'm going to have a vision about you. I mean, it's all kind of convenient. So the picture was of a coldly legalistic Seventh-day Adventist church governed by fear of going against the divine testimonies of its prophetess. Some of her prophecies proved false, and some of them even disagreed with scientific fact, and it didn't bother her or them. Newsweek and
Why do people go on with that?
I can't explain.
You know, I'm afraid and what else do they
They want to be led.
Yeah.
They have to be want to be led.
It's the motivations of people for doing what they do is almost infinite. I don't claim to. Newsweek, January 14th, 1861, I had an article on Ellen G. White. Between 1844 and her death in 1915, she wrote more than 46 volumes, totaling 25 million words on the Bible, history, and health. Mrs. White's prodigious literary output was based largely upon the 2,000 or so visions she claimed to have had, in which the voice of God instructed her on everything from biblical interpretation to diet and dress. So how did the Church of God interpret the Bible, eat, and dress for 2,000 years without Ellen G. White? I mean, there was not an Ellen G. White in the Pergamus era. There wasn't, I mean, you know. But now, 66 years after Ellen White's death, the notion that she was a true prophetess of God is being questioned by Adventist scholars themselves, who argue that many of her revelations were copied from other 19th century writers without attribution, and that, borrowed or not, some of the most important ones cannot be squared with Scripture. The copying charge was leveled by Mr. Rea, who was a pastor of the Seventh-day Adventist Church in Long Beach, California, who spent 2 years analyzing Mrs. White's work. Rea insists that the heart of Adventist theology was also copied from others. In all, he estimates as much as 80% of Mrs. White's writing was lifted almost word for word from the earlier works. So there's an honesty issue coming in here. What bothers him the most, however, is not her failure to attribute her ideas to their source, but her insistence on attributing them to God. The Adventist establishment has had a harder time responding to the theological challenge posed by Mr. Ford, who said that before Mrs. White came on the scene, followers of early Adventist preacher William Miller had believed Christ would return on October 22nd, 1844, to cleanse the earthly sanctuary of sin. So on that date, Miller and his flock gathered on a boulder in upper New York State, I thought it was Missouri, to await his second coming. When Christ failed to appear, most Millerites lost their faith, but some rallied around Mrs. White, who taught that Miller had merely misinterpreted Daniel's revelation. The real sanctuary, she said, was in heaven. What happened on October 2nd, she said, was that Jesus moved from one heavenly apartment to another in order to begin the final investigative judgment upon the righteous, which would precede his return to the earth. So Christ got a spiritual U-Haul and moved from one apartment to the next apartment. Mrs. White's reinterpretation saved the Adventist movement. Now, is this a little bit too convenient in one sense? In his massive study, Ford argues that Scripture simply does not support White's interpretation of Daniel. No scholar, he said, seriously believed that Jesus Christ is sitting in heaven turning pages to investigate Christian lives, which is true. So, and then there's other articles I could go through. I don't want to do too much reading to you, but where people say that she had a form of epilepsy called partial complex seizures. The similarities are eyes that are open and often turned up. Historical accounts report White's eyes rolled up during visions. Words or phrases that are repeated monotonously. White is characterized as repeating light, dark, glory, and glory to God during visions. Gestures, White reportedly wrung her hands, walked back and forth, and gracefully moved her shoulders around in ecstatic states. Visual hallucinations, including crude sensations of light and darkness. White spoke of light and dark during her visions, and so forth. Anything in the Bible give you any kind of parallel to that at all? It's not the way God works with His people. It's not the way He communicates. So she maintained that on October 22nd, we read this, but it's worth repeating. We read something similar. Christ stopped pleading for sinners in one apartment of a heavenly sanctuary and went into a second sanctuary only to plead for the elect. So that was her argument. Instead of pleading for all Christians, Christ gave up on all of them and went to only plead for the elect. Only Adventist believers, in other words, would be saved. So, just a little bit too convenient. Let's just put it that way. Also, now another thing they note in terms of going through her writings, that Ellen White made a number of statements on health that are now known to be scientifically false. She wrote that wigs congest the brain and that people will become hopelessly insane if they wear wigs.
Well, I don't wear one.
Yeah.
Did it work?
Yeah, right. Too late. She believed that. Well, okay, we won't go into that. This is a little crass. That eating meat strengthened man's animal propensities, and that some races began by sexual relations with animals. Right. Okay.
She must have been horribly racist then.
Well, one word. Now, doctrinal differences. Seventh-day Adventists, initially, they don't believe a lot of this anymore. They're very traditional Protestant now. They're moving that direction. But initially, they were the ones that came up with observing the Passover quarterly instead of annually. Absolute ban on alcohol, which you can't justify biblically. And they had grape juice at Passover. They also began to believe that Christ was resurrected on a Sunday. They believed in the Trinity, and many of them believed in the Trinity, although I think that wavered, because I've heard Seventh-day Adventists who didn't believe in the Trinity, but the trend in the Seventh-day Adventist church is they're paralleling, and it's happening in Church of God Seventh-day as well, they're paralleling what's happening worldwide. They're liberalizing extremely. Okay, in the Church of God became a less, not highly organized, fairly diffuse group. It was groups across the country, and they'd have their different headquarters, fairly loosely organized, operating on the local church. How many of you remember the Bible Advocate from reading the autobiography? This was a publication of the Church of God, I think out of Stanbury, Missouri. Still being published today. Mr. Armstrong wrote for the publication in the 20s and the 30s, even after he'd started the Radio Church of God. They were in Battle Creek, Michigan is where they were, and then they moved to Marion, Ohio, and then to Stansbury, Missouri at the time Mr. Armstrong dealt with them. As I said, this is the era or portion of the Sardis church that sent out a lot of missionaries. They never made a big impact in the United States, but in South America and in Africa, they had a fairly big impact. We're still running across groups that were seeded by these people.
They were in China too, because of my family history. I don't know, 200 years ago, there's a Seventh-day Adventist in my family history, and he was in China. He was a physician. So they put healing, the medical industry, along with preaching the kingdom of God.
Yeah, it was always tied together. They oftentimes would, they would teach principles of health too.
They've got one up in Black Hills in South Dakota, a place where you can go if you have some serious illness.
Yeah.
Hospital and stuff.
And so they go through here that shows that, they sent out missionary efforts to Jerusalem, South Africa, Australia, Egypt, England, Norway, Jamaica, Guam, Canada, Nova Scotia. Nova Scotia is in Canada. Liberia, Barbados, Venezuela, Syria, Madagascar, Burma, Newfoundland, and Mexico. And interestingly enough, Worldwide used to get letters from these various groups in South America, especially, was where they'd run across these people that had dwindled down to one local group, and they were still trying to hold on to as much of the doctrine as possible. They came across us, and they were just ecstatic in many cases that somebody else taught, that they knew they got it back in, dim history. They got it from another group in America, but they'd lost touch with them and everything else. And so we used to get fairly enthusiastic groups that wanted to come along with us because they didn't like being an independent church, which today, unfortunately, ought to break off some Worldwide revel in being an independent church.
Mr. Hernandez still gets requests in Mexico and one South American country all the time for taped sermons and literature in Spanish.
It used to be the biggest, I think, country of all of it was Chile. Is where we got most of them, but some from Venezuela and Colombia. I think he's talked about running into people all over, South America that have come from. He can tell that somewhere in the ancient times they came out of the Church of God. These groups were called something like the Israelite Church of the New Covenant. They'd lost the Church of God name. So they weren't necessarily Church of God, but they were kind of trying to maintain as much of the truth as they had. So it really resonated when they came across us. Okay. Now this is a guy I never heard of before. Did you ever hear of a guy by the name of John Kies? Kiez? He evidently worked pretty strongly with Mr. Armstrong. He's in the Church of God Seventh-day, and he was fairly strongly associated with Mr. Armstrong until he disagreed with the opening of Ambassador College and split off. I never heard of the guy.
Did you look in the autobiography to see if he's...
Didn't have time to.
Where did he go at that point? Back to Church God Seventh-day?
Yeah. Although then he split with the Church of God Advent group over the issue of Pentecostals. Some of the Church of God became charismatic, and so in other words, the process we saw of breaking off, like what happened after Worldwide, absolutely not unprecedented. It has happened for 2,000 years.
In our Christian homeschool group, when I said we were the Church of God, because I wasn't identifying myself as Worldwide or Living with Global, or just call ourselves the Church of God. She said, "Oh, the Pentecostal church." I'm like,
No.
Not even.
That's the Assembly of God.
No, the Church of God.
Yeah.
The Church of God movement is
Cleveland,
Pentecostal.
Tennessee, there's a whole denomination just called.
And they're Pentecostal. And they're
They still trace their roots back to the Azusa Street 1906 revival. But they're
That's interesting.
in Tennessee.
Okay,
No.
I didn't think so.
no. Sabbath seems to be one of the first things they lose, actually. And then with that goes, Passover kind of goes before Sabbath, and then after that goes Trinity. You just start accepting stuff like that. This is the tail end of the Sardis church. When it was, Christ said in Revelation 3 that they're dead, and there's just a few that had the lights on, and I think you can make a pretty good case that the few whose lights were still on came into the Church of God Philadelphian era, because they got to where they eventually started up their own radio program. They developed their own correspondence course. They got to,
Seventh-day, are you talking?
yeah. 1925, the number of churches was 79 churches in 17 states. That's smaller than we are. So, they started using radio, but they never really had a big impact. The two big groups in the United States that represent the Sardis era Church of God would be the Church of God Seventh-day, which is very small, in fact, probably smaller than we are, and the Seventh-day Baptists, which are smaller than we are. So they've dwindled down to practically nothing. There's no growth going on. We had it would have been really interesting in the early 1920s, or even before that. Milton, Wisconsin is a small town outside of Madison that was a church, or Seventh-day Baptist town. The entire town virtually was Seventh-day Baptist. They rolled up the sidewalks on Friday afternoon and didn't. They had a college there called Milton College. You can drive there. You can see that at one time they were a going concern, but they died. Just a painful death. They finally closed the college, and now there's almost no influence of the Sabbatarians in the group at all, in the town at all.
My brother lives in Corona, which is next to Riverside in L.A., and evidently Corona, there must be a lot of Seventh-day Adventists, because his wife is complaining they always close on Saturday.
Well, that's because, how many of you heard of the Loma Linda Medical Center out there? That's a Seventh-day Adventist. It's world famous. Seemed to be one of the things they got into the most.
They've got one in D.C. too, one in Florida. Loma Linda Medical Conference.
Yeah. Loma Linda, you hear that term, it's probably Seventh-day Adventist. Okay, now we're starting to get into modern times. How many of you have been in the church over 20 years? How many over 30? Just you? Lupe needs to be here.
Yeah, Lupe beat everybody.
Yeah, right. Well,
103.
That goes to show the history of the Church of God Philadelphian era, Revelation 3, is basically 75 years old. Okay? So if you figure a rough starting date of 1920 when God started working with Mr. Actually, when was it he was called? 28, 29, something like that? 27? Yeah, he was baptized. So we're coming up on about 70 years of the Church of God in this era. We've lived through a lot of that history, although most of us have lived through it in the sense of, I think it's a great analogy, that thing about the blind man and the elephant. Ever remember that, anybody? Where you describe an elephant, and you put these four blind men were describing an elephant, and one says it's like a snake because he was holding onto the trunk. Another says it's like a tree because he's holding onto the leg. And another one said it's, I forget what the other ones were.
Branches holding onto the tree.
And so the idea is we only see a part of it. I would love to see a balanced, balanced history of the Church of God the past 70 years. It would not be pretty. There are skeletons buried and bodies buried in places. There were times when we were distinctly out of balance as to how we approached and did things. But it would be, I think, more fascinating if it was well done than the best novel you ever read. A lot of that we've seen, and most of it we haven't seen. It's emotion charged in a lot of ways because some of you came out of some of these. The idea of people splitting off has been happening for 2,000 years. To some degree, we're more acutely aware of it because now we're a corporate organization, whereas in times past they didn't operate so much that way. So people came and went and started their own group and everything else, and I don't know that they took it in the same way, maybe not as personally, I don't know. But actually, they were pretty vehement about the way they approached their churches in the old days, let's say. So we're in kind of a fascinating period of time. I don't know that any of us would be capable of being objective and balanced in terms of discussing, to take a look at the history of Mr. Armstrong and to acknowledge the areas he got out of balance, and yet also acknowledge the areas that he had some profound understanding. Like, I heard Mr. Armstrong talk about the two trees, probably 200 sermons, and I have never, until just the past year or so, come to understand how fundamental it is to everything. Everything comes down to, am I in charge or is God in charge? It's a fundamental decision of mankind.
Or I decided.
Right. That it's government, but it's in effect, it's even more than government. It's an issue of
Submission.
who runs life, who should run life, who is the authority in life, me or God. Fundamentally, and 99% of the people would like to say that it's God. That's one thing to say, it's another thing to do it.
Not reality.
We all see the reality around us that is just not the case. And so it's hard when Raymond McNair leaves and realize here's an evangelist who doesn't get it. And probably hasn't gotten it for a good longer than what we tried to optimistically hope that he was getting it before. And how many of us in this room, it's like Ron Dart's famous sermon on next year, many of you won't be here for the feast, and next year he wasn't there for the feast. Yeah, right. But him who thinks he stand, take heed lest he fall. It's going to be a real interesting, I do think the family that we create by enduring what's going to come in the next few years is going to be incredible. I mean, as far as people that you'd give your life for, in effect. It's almost like, I've been reading a lot of books lately on World War II, Band of Brothers, Beyond Valor, and some of these other ones, that talk about how when the friendships and relationships built under intense outside pressure and suffering oftentimes last for the rest of your life. And, you stop what you're doing on a moment's notice to cross the country to help a friend who you once sat in a foxhole with. We're going to have, and short of war, I don't know how you can experience that, but we're going to have much the same experience from what we're going to go through in coming years. But that's going to make it all the more painful when that person that was in the foxhole with you abandons his calling at some point.
But it is exciting too, though. Really, this is exciting.
I think it is.
Exploits and things that are going to happen, and the witness we're going to give this world. I mean, really, there's a really positive background about it.
And that's a salesman talking, and that's good, because but I mean, that's what makes a successful salesman. You do think about the positives. And so, on the one hand, because I got calls last night after Dave Burson died, and people are saying, man, what's going on? And it's kind of like, I can't tell you what's going on. Ask the boss. But, all I know is it doesn't change anything. And because we've heard of good friends recently. And there was a local elder who recently left to go with this group breaking off in Florida. And I know this guy, and I love this guy, and I want to slap him silly and say, how are you going to do the work with this two-bit band of renegades down there? How are you going to do what God called you to do? Was there an injustice done? Let's concede that there was an injustice done. That doesn't change what we're called to do. Let God worry about the injustice, and you keep doing what you were called to do. I can't believe people can convince themselves to do this. I had another family that left over eating out on the Sabbath. Is that the core issue that we decide how we're going to fulfill our calling? If we don't keep our heads on straight better than that, if we don't develop greater spiritual maturity than that, then some curveball down the line is going to catch us.
If somebody feels like they shouldn't eat out on the Sabbath, then they shouldn't eat out on the Sabbath.
Yeah, then don't eat. Don't do it.
When I explained it to the guy that called last night, he said, yeah, I never thought about it that way.
Do you think there's a weeding process that's still going on, that God is encouraging these people that if you're not really going to stick with what you've been taught, why don't you go somewhere else?
I don't know if God needs to get involved with it, because I think Satan works hard enough that he knocks the nuts off the tree, so to speak, on his own. Although, things like the changing of the name of the Church of God, Worldwide Church of God, to something else, I see that as being God's hand.
I've been praying for that.
Yeah, me too.
That they shouldn't call the Church of God.
And by the same token, the sifting process, I think God does have a purpose in sifting, and it's we can talk about it being in Florida, we can talk about it being in the Northwest. If it happened in Albuquerque, we wouldn't understand the people that would break off. Why in the world would you do that? And it would be much more personal, and it would hurt that much more. But it doesn't change anything.
Some of these people break off for greed. They want the dollar, or they want the tithe, or they want something. There's some other motivation. Or power, or control, or...
Power for 17 people.
Well, some people are motivated that way. It really is. Power is supposed to be the ultimate.
Yeah, my God.
Well, they never grow. That's the problem. They generally split.
They don't
don't know if theirs won't grow.
A good example of that would be, if you read the letter where David Hume stated why he left you